Okay, so Bill was at EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Shortly after Trump was elected in 2016, and he saw firsthand how demoralized the agency was. So we decided to do a book that focuses on two main themes: why we need a strong environmental protection agency, and what does the agency actually do? When we were getting started, I asked a number of people this question: so what does the EPA do? And pretty much the standard answer I got was, they protect the air and water. There was always this little dangling question mark at the end, which was pretty much what I knew about EPA at that point. So I'm going to take a few minutes here and summarize a few of the basics and give a short history of EPA. Much of what EPA does is because of 6 congressional acts that were passed in the 1970s. And pretty much every 2 years apart, starting in 1970 with the Clean Air Act, 72, the Clean Water Act, then the Safe Drinking Water Act in 74. In 1976, there were 2 acts, the Toxic Substances Control Act and RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act that regulates hazardous waste. And then in 1980, Superfund. Except for Superfund, these acts were signed into law by Republican presidents Nixon and Ford. During the 1970s, the US Congress was the most environmentally progressive legislative body in history. Before EPA was established, environmental regulations were almost entirely left up to the states. And the problem was that states have a strong vested interest in attracting and holding on to business and industry, which can translate into pretty weak environmental regulations. There's also the problem that air and water pollution don't respect state boundaries. And so when EPA was established, suddenly it didn't matter if you lived in West Virginia or Oregon, you had to do it, or pay a fine and then do it. When Nixon established the EPA in 1970, it wasn't because he cared about the environment. He just wanted to get, quote, those environmental crazies off my back, as well as deflect attention from Vietnam and civil rights. It was said when Nixon established the EPA that he saw a mob coming, jumped in front of it, and called it a parade. The first decade was EPA's honeymoon years. There was strong bipartisan support because the public was loud and insistent that we're going to get our act together and start protecting the environment. And then came Ronald Reagan in 1980, whose personal opinion, as he put it, was if EPA had its way, you and I would live like rabbits. He appointed Ann Gorsuch, a Colorado state legislator recommended by the Coors family, as his EPA administrator. Gorsuch basically wrote the playbook on how to undermine and hobble the EPA. Her strategies involved large proposed budget cuts under the guise of efficiency, key appointments from the businesses that EPA is charged with regulating, ignoring the advice of career EPA employees, making enforcement of regulations a low priority, and replacing scientific advisory committees with industry-friendly members. In spite of the damage during the Reagan administration, during the 1980s, there was continued strong bipartisan support in Congress and a determined public to support EPA. Then in 1994, the country's center of gravity changed with Newt Gingrich and the end of a working bipartisan Congress. The war on the EPA and science has intensified since that time. A whole new level of antagonism emerged during the Obama presidency, with its environmental pushes in climate change, clean air and water, and renewable energy. Because Obama couldn't get anything done through Congress, he turned to executive orders, making it possible for Trump to just overturn them, which is what has happened in many cases. Basically, everything Obama did, Trump just had a knee-jerk reaction to undo it. And of course, Trump's actions are also centered around embracing oil and gas and reviving the coal industry. Trump has led the charge in demonizing EPA because of overregulation. EPA can be overly prescriptive, but the reality is much more complicated. Establishing any environmental regulation relies heavily on scientific findings and is a lengthy, challenging, and often futile undertaking. So let's look at a few examples here. No new chemicals have been added to drinking water regulations for over 2 decades. Agriculture is today's most pervasive source of water pollution and is almost completely unregulated. After nearly a half century, major battles are still being fought over which water bodies are subject to regulation under the Clean Water Act. And then, of course, there's EPA's role in regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, which has set off the environmental version of the Civil War. One of the things we've made clear in the book is that the Trump administration has been the most serious threat to the agency to date, but the war on the EPA can be traced back decades. The most far-reaching damage has come from undermining the foundation upon which the agency's legitimacy rests, its scientific integrity and capability. Pretty much everything EPA does depends on rigorous and responsible scientific studies. Over the past couple decades, Americans have been subjected to a propaganda campaign to discredit science. This campaign has come alarmingly close to accomplishing its goal by elevating people who don't have a clue what they're talking about to the same level as scientists who have worked long and hard to understand tough environmental problems. EPA is coming up on its 50th anniversary next month. A lot has changed in a half century. We no longer have burning rivers and urban air pollution so bad that it looks like Beijing. But the need for a strong EPA is as crucial today as 50 years ago. Air and water pollution remain an ongoing and serious problem in many areas. Another problem is that some of the most serious environmental problems today cannot be seen by the naked eye. In other words, chemicals and climate change.
So as Rosemarie mentioned, what we do is we try to tackle issues that EPA is facing, and we look at the science, the politics, and the human dimension of those issues. One of the things, and I thought I knew EPA very well, but one of the things you realize very quickly when you start digging into all this is EPA is an incredibly complicated organization. And I should say, I'll also point out that although people think of EPA maybe as in Washington, D.C., actually much of the day-to-day, most actually of the day-to-day action actually takes place in 10 regional offices, one of which is right there in Denver. And those offices work with the states to basically fulfill the acts and the missions and so regulations of EPA. So there's that very important kind of connection between Washington, D.C., the regional offices, and the states. And it doesn't always work, as Flint, Michigan actually demonstrated, but it often does. So we couldn't cover everything. So we basically looked at a number of types of issues, and then we basically explored the challenges of regulation, and as Rosemarie mentioned, we looked at how science is crippling the EPA's ability to regulate almost anything. Just a little bit about how the book's structured. We capture 4 topics, main topics: drinking water. Rose mentioned the Safe Drinking Water Act, and we look at a number of different things: perchlorate, disinfection byproducts, environmental justice. So to give you an idea there, we can't tackle all aspects of Safe Drinking Water Act, but we tackle some of the key ones. And then water pollution, which is under the Clean Water Act. Rose mentioned what's known as the waters of the United States, to defining the sort of what's covered by the Clean Water Act. Agriculture is important, and part of that actually are concentrated animal feeding operations. And then there are other issues like coal ash and harmful algal blooms that have gotten a lot of attention in recent times. Then we look at air pollution and climate change. Climate change seems to be a big issue here these days, and EPA's role in it has been very important. But that's under the Clean Air Act. And I'll go into a couple examples on that actually in a moment. And then finally, we cover the toxic chemicals and hazardous waste, and there we focus in on the Toxic Substances Control Act and RCRA, particularly on leaking underground storage tanks, and then Superfund, which is actually an extraordinarily complicated program. There are other aspects too. We don't actually delve too much into the pesticide side of EPA, but that's another very important part of EPA's domain, if you will. So actually, EPA's role in climate change goes back to at least 1998, when the EPA administrator Carol Browner under Bill Clinton was asked whether or not the Clean Air Act regulations covered greenhouse gas emissions. And she said yes. And when she went back to talk to her lawyers within the agency, they said yes, if it's an air pollutant and the administrator finds that it endangers public health or welfare. So then along came George W. Bush. His administration had a different opinion. It does not. So 12 states and others sued the EPA in a case known as Massachusetts versus EPA. This is probably maybe the most important single environmental issue that has come before the Supreme Court. And in 2007, narrowly by 5-4, the Supreme Court basically said, yes, EPA does, you can regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, but first you need to find an endangerment finding, which the Obama administration did in 2009. And that was all around autos, and then they extended that to power plants, which the Supreme Court upheld. So when Obama came along, he tried to do, basically his first attempt was to try to do a cap and trade type thing, where you would have, basically it costs money to exhume greenhouse gases, and then that money is returned in some general way, either through tax breaks overall, but basically encouraging people to encouraging all kinds of adaptations through an economic pressure, if you will. The House passed it, it died in the Senate. So at that point, Obama basically decided that he wanted to reduce greenhouse gases by 28% from 2005 levels by 2025. And so this was an agreement actually that Obama worked out with President Xi in China. And there were really three major ways in which EPA was going to achieve this goal. The first one was through greater fuel efficiency for cars and light trucks. The second one, which we all know about, is coal-fired power plants. And the third one is methane from oil and gas operations. The final thing I should say about climate change is, of course, we're all aware that the Paris climate agreement, we pulled out of it the day after the election. That's something we can go back into, but is something that, we've kind of lost our credibility and we've lost a lot of time on.